So, good morning. It's really incredible to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Anna, and the rest of the team. So I'm a policy fellow at LSE. I trained as an architect, and it's really nice to be in a room without so many architects, actually, and I'm assuming. And I worked in practice for a little bit, and then I went back to India, which is actually where I grew up, and I did a fair amount. I spent about a decade looking at sanitation infrastructure and designing and building sanitation infrastructure. And the issues around sort of gendered access to toilets is sort of segued quite beautifully, and a lot of the methods very similar. And similarly, I too will be doing a methods talk tomorrow. And that has led to more recent work, which is what I'm talking about today, around how young girls feel in the public domain. I'm not going to talk specifically about parks, but actually just public space more in general, and parks are a kind of critical part of that. And I do want to highlight that this is all work that I've done with my research assistant, Olivia, and I've also been working with Make Space for Girls. I think they might be the Hollywood star who ties everyone together. I've forgotten his name. Right, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this because there's been a lot of talk already about the really depressing statistics around women in the public domain. But so we all know that generally public space is unfriendly for young girls, and there's been a range of stats on that. I do want to say, though, that my work is currently very, I've worked in India, very UK and European specific, and actually a lot of the research that we are putting into our reports that you can find online are very, I would say, kind of European-centric, and I just want to recognise that. And I think, Rachel, it was really interesting to, I think we do need to think about the rest of the world, and not all research translates evenly. We also know, and I think, again, I don't need to dwell on this too much, that youth facilities in public space do not cater well or appeal for young women. And there's a backdrop to this wider problem around a lack of investment, and I'm so glad you described it in those terms of the violence of austerity. And I think we have to talk about that youth expenditure is just sort of absolutely been decimated since 2010. And then that means that it's a particularly acute problem that when an investment does come, and money does land in this country, is that when it does come, it's entirely in these sort of skate parks and BMX tracks. And we've already discussed why that's so problematic. There is also, in thinking about the academics in the room, about what we can do, there isn't very much literature out there. I mean, I've quoted that Swedish study that's already been mentioned, and I think we're all self-referencing each other. And so that actually just speaks to the real need to widen this pool of research. But we are beginning to get a really good picture, and my boss at the department said, God, yeah, this is actually a real issue, to which I was going, yeah, no shit. So, we have these awful stats, and I think one of the ones what I want to highlight on this board is that even those girls, and referencing it when Imogen was saying that let's fix the girls, and as an avid football player myself, is that even those girls who are good at skating and want to skate, they don't. So we have a real problem there. And someone else mentioned too about how patterns that are set at around this sort of teenage years, which is what my work focuses on, is really important because these tend to be set then for life. Something that hasn't actually been talked about yet is that actually a lot of the decision makers we know that young girls are harassed, and we know that there's a problem with the provision, but also we have a real problem with decision-making processes. And because planning processes for public space have an age and have a gender problem. So there is a growing body of work in sort of architecture and engineering and broadly in development circles around this. And there was a study done in London that found that 89% of 16 to 18-year-olds have never been asked about their neighbourhood. And another study that said that only 8% had even attended any kind of consultation. But contrary to that, Girl Guiding did a study and said 82% of girls thought that they should be involved in designing and planning. And so this gap between this enormous willingness to want to get involved and being involved actually suggests that we need new mechanisms. Why I think, if you can join a methods talk, that is so important, because it is an actualization of these rights into the sort of real sphere that's the problem. That we all know what the problem is we need to actualize this stuff. And so for me, I think this work is speaking to that problem, which is about how young voices, and particularly young girls' voices, can be represented in the sphere of the built environment and development and planning. So what we've done is we've set up what's called a Researcher in Residence program, and it's really, peer research is not something that I've invented. It's a sort of a method where individuals who have the personal experience of the research topic do the investigating themselves, and I think that speaks to your comment from sorry, I've forgotten your name, that wonderful comment that you made, which I thought was so provocative about actually, I was thinking, I really shouldn't be presenting. One of the girls who I've hired should be here in my place. And I hope that in the next conference I will make that happen. And so what we've structured is largely this paid learning and working experience where they come to the LSE and undertake a kind of a curriculum, and that curriculum is bespoke to each site that we work in, because parks, I think, in a suburb are very different to parks in an inner city, and development lands in very different ways, even in London, you could say, so, and definitely throughout the rest of the UK. And so we try to attenuate our curriculum to those very localised issues, but at the same time hit the big things at the same time. And the curriculum, because I'm an architect, is very architecture heavy, but it's also drawing, because the LSE doesn't actually have an architecture department, I'm situated within the School of Social Policy and Sociology, so we really learn from anthropology and ethnography and try and get the girls who we work with to do all this. We see this project as actually something between research and advocacy. So on the one hand, it is about evidence making, it's about collecting findings and research by girls for girls. But it's also about making the case that young women should and can be more meaningfully involved and are perfectly capable of articulating themselves in really powerful and compelling ways. And the research question that we frame around all of our projects is this really simple one of like, how have girls been designed out of public space? So we're currently working, so I'm going to present findings mostly from Crewe and Trowbridge, which was a project we did last year. And then I'm going to draw a little bit on Brent, which we completed in the autumn. But I've included some photographs from, we've currently got a scheme up and running in Hemel Hempstead. A girl is currently doing her right to work check from Clapham, so we should be up and running with that soon, and I'm recruiting in Barking and Ebbsfleet as we speak. And we're talking about, I've hired about 15 girls last year, and another sort of more coming this year. Recruiting is a real challenge, which is perhaps another talk. In terms of the methods, we mostly use, it's a mixture of in-person and online, and so the kind of curriculum is centered around weekly discussions, and those discussions are supported by content that we pull from the world, but also from content that we create, so we can be really site-specific and really reactive to weekly discussions. And we see this as knowledge creation in itself, which I think builds on a lot of feminist literatures. I'm not going to talk about methods because I'm doing that tomorrow. If you're not here tomorrow and want to know more, please just do reach in touch and I can show you our mirror boards and how we work. And it was in one of those discussions that we asked a young 17-year-old about spaces that she uses, where she goes, and she responded by saying, there's nowhere for girls. There's literally not a specific place for girls. And there's places where we go, but not spaces for us. And another one chimed in, sort of ironically, well, our toilet. And what our research is fundamentally about is this disconnect between girls and women and the areas in which they live. And she continued, there are private spaces for girls, but no public spaces for girls. And yeah, there's nothing stopping us from going through the gates, but we don't feel we should. Her answer reveals how young women's access to and use of public space is inextricably tied to their notions of who is an appropriate public and what is an appropriate presence, use and ownership of space. And our research found lots of things that have already been reiterated today. And so I was thinking about, well, what is this, if this method is useful, surely it should be revealing something that hasn't been revealed in another way, in more traditional ways, maybe I could say. And Olivia and I really feel that one of the things that has come out through this method of hiring young girls has been this idea of how women are judged, and that actually that judgment is linked to physical morphologies that compose of public spaces. So whilst there is a compelling body of research that addresses the judgment that young people experience in their public lives, these explorations are often focused on social and interpersonal stigma and actually fail to embrace the spatialization of judgment, to question its material manifestation, and to consider these intersectional dynamics, such as the aged as well as gendered dimension of judgment. And there is a small but significant body of literature that signals how adolescents are judged and stigmatized. And it's sort of loosely into two categories. The first is, because public space is viewed to be under adult ownership, teenagers as autonomous users are perceived to disrupt a moral order of the street. And because public space is divided by age lines, so children and adults, and teenagers don't fit into this neat binary, and so once again, they disrupt this moral order of our built environment. And it's in this moral panic over the place of teenagers that young people are not only judged as perpetrators of disorderliness in public space, but also, and especially for their parents, as potential victims. Whilst parents of young children feel that teens are threatening in public spaces like playgrounds, parents of teenagers fear the behaviors that teens might turn to in public space, such as drinking and smoking. And so in a GLA report, Making London Child-Friendly, they note children, particularly teenagers, are a complicated presence in public space, often stereotyped as proponents of antisocial behavior, whilst also imposed with mobility restrictions due to the perceived dangers of public space. However, all these arguments lack this gendered perspective. But the geographer Tracy Skeltonen, I don't know how to say her name, I apologize, in her phenomenal piece, Nothing to Do, Nowhere to Go, investigates the ways in which a small group of teenagers living in South Wales use the streets. And she argues that girls can be conceptualized as occupying an ambiguous and often uncomfortable position of being the wrong age, the wrong gender, and in the wrong place. So we found, adding to this literature, that judgment is a physical, material reality that permeates the daily lives of young women on various scales, from the objects that compose the public realm, a bench, to certain delineated spaces, the playground, to a whole network of spaces like the high street. And in doing so, we turn to judgment as not only interpersonal, but as a physical materiality which shape women's perspective on what is acceptable presence and use of public space. And whilst we're working within this framework, it's really important that whilst we can recognize that physical form does affect our lives as dwellers, we don't want to perpetrate some problematic arguments that modernist architects loved, such as the broken windows theory. We cannot design out social realities such as sexism, unfortunately. Rachel, it would be much easier if we could. But we can acknowledge that social issues permeate our physical worlds and are reinforced by these worlds in ways that let people know if they are included and on what terms. So I think it's really important to say that through this work is, I don't think we're attenuating enough to issues along race, ethnicity, sexuality, and class. And that's something that I think I need to do more as we go forward. So what have we found? We found that all young women thought that benches were very important physical morphologies to hang out in. But for young women confined to other spaces, the bench was used almost as a way to replace the muga and the playground. To quote, "What I most use is a bench. I don't use the mugas." But she paused and continued, "These are not for us, they're for older people." So all of our young researchers have noted that the stereotypical bench, that classic 2-4-seater, is often with anti-homeless armrests, which they're equally offended by, is not for them. They catered predominantly to other people. And the experience of judgment that the young woman then felt is unsurprising when one considers that many young girls and young persons hang out in groups, socialization, and that these spaces are actively designed to say, you can't socialize here, so it's clearly not for them. Like benches, swings were both materialities that young women used and wanted to use, but ones where they also felt that they were being judged. In the first sense, they felt judgment because of the reality of the swings designs were not made to accommodate young women's bodies after childhood. One of the young researchers who liked swings describes going with her sister that girls wouldn't want to go to a swing anyway, especially over a certain age. if you're seen in a park space or a children's space, you get judged and laughed at. Also, getting stuck on the seat. If there are lads there, it's like your worst nightmare come true, so you don't want to go back. And she described how her sister had felt embarrassed and judgment for using swings when during puberty. These realities, so such realities make girls feel judged for using these spaces as they're clearly designed for a different body. In a conversation in Trowbridge about the swings, one woman noted, the size of things can infer who it's for. Why does it have to be one size? Others noted in the panacea of feminist policy and design in Scandinavia that they have swings of different types and designs there, and sort of kind of questioning, why don't we have that? Also commenting on this sort of their clothing and their school clothing and skirts being really not good for swinging on, and then continued, in the heat, you also don't want to flash teenage boys or men. So most girls expressed that there were these sort of also gendered assumptions around girls and space that limited their movement into skate parks and mugas. And these assumptions they recognized were both upheld in their minds and in the minds of boys. But they also sort of clearly articulated that the actual designs of these spaces are deterrents, their enclosure, and it felt that they couldn't participate in these spaces in a non-competitive way. The girls felt that judgment was exacerbated in spaces where there were more rules and surveillance, as the girls felt that they were often the target of this surveillance, being perceived as perpetrators rather than those worthy of being kept safe. And I think something about why high streets are so important is that girls move through spaces in very different ways to boys, and high streets are actually critical pieces of infrastructure. And I've not read anything really about the loss of high street and its impact on young girls, which was something that I found really alarming. Young people feel a lot of stigma. So there's a lot of stigma about people our age loitering. I tend to avoid them because I don't want to be frowned upon. It's a stigma from other generations and other people with time to spare. Shame that one group will ruin it for all of us. Even if I'm meeting a friend or waiting, people will walk past and frown. Girls particularly felt this if they were in mixed sex groups, so you're very signaled to leave. They also felt that there was kind of appropriate conduct was being asked by them. One of them described how she was moved on just for smoking a cigarette, which she thought was unfair, and it is. Consequently, it means that girls and young women feel that they need a purpose to venture out. So that, and young women won't venture out of their local radiuses without having an explicit purpose. So here's a quote, for example, and this is in Brent in London. I love Kilburn High Road, but I know why people hate it. I wouldn't go there and sit on the benches. The only time my friends go there is if they have to pick something up at Argos. This was because they often felt intimidated to occupy the space, such as by lingering men, or there weren't amenities that were inviting them to linger in the first place, such as interesting youth facilities, and young women therefore move completely differently to their male peers. There are things they value, and in Brent, the only thing that I've actually heard really positive things uniformly across a cohort is the value of the Brent Public Library, which is no surprise as a space that received a lot of money and serves its community. And if the library feels like the most inviting space, you can always I love this quote, you can pretend you're studying and then you can go to the outlet. I mean, it's the most teenager thing I've ever heard. But overwhelmingly, they felt that public spaces were either adult spaces, unaffordable retail, or male spaces, boys spaces like mugas, or children's ones like playgrounds. So there's actually, and in policy terms, and in our imaginaries, there's this real lack of what is a teenage space. And so that's fundamentally what we're trying to do with this curriculum, is to give young people the time and space to articulate that. I don't know what that is, and I've trained as an architect. And I think that goes back to your point about if you were to get a group of young girls into a room and to say, do you want a muga? I guarantee you a lot of them would say, sure, I'll have that. And that's the point of this method of doing research and giving someone consultation time and giving co-production time, is that in order to push against such normalized patterns of behavior, I think we need new methods by which to do that and to reveal these kind of new imaginaries for public space. So finally, God, I'm running out of time. I wanted to end with a little bit about some existing work in academia around material culture that does reinforce, I guess, this position that I'm trying to put out there, that objects are not static, and that there's so Leopold and Blanche, who are these sort of feminist urbanists, they say that there's a strong articulation between the material and symbolic dimension of space, and that is that objects are artifacts of our society. The height of a swing may display how our society views the age limits of play, but also agents of the society. They reinforce and negotiate social realities, so that once made, the swing reiterates the idea that teenagers are not invited to play. So, of course, there's a lot of literature now, particularly from, I'm sure, all of our hero Kern and Criado Perez, sort of feminist urban thinkers that are conceptualizing urban space. But there's others like Butler, who talks about the capacity to move depends upon instruments and surfaces that make movement possible, and that bodily movements is supported and facilitated by non-human objects and their particular capacity for change. And I'm thinking about the fences and that wonderful array of actual objects in our built environment and how disastrous they can be. And one of the things that really strikes me is that despite considerable advances in our understanding of children and teenagers' spatial agency and playful needs, the design of public playgrounds in this country hasn't changed since the 1930s. And it's so dominated by an industry of manufactured play equipment. And so for that reason, and just to end on my favorite current quote, is that no amount of lighting is going to abolish the patriarchy. So as long as the primary decision makers in cities, who are still mostly men, are making choices about everything from urban economic policy to housing design, school placement, bus seating, blah, it's something that I, as an architect, must also remind myself that we must go beyond urban design to these sort of deep structural reforms that are needed. And that's why I would like to really invite you to come to the Methods talk tomorrow, because for me that is a methodological project. It's a political project of how co-production isn't tokenistic but genuine. And I'll end there and hopefully on time.